Picture this. Your husband comes home from work, loosens his tie, and asks you to set the table for 3 because his secretary is joining you for dinner to discuss a work project. You smile, pour the wine, light the candles, and serve them. Both like the perfect hostess you've been trained to be. Meanwhile, they exchange glances across your dining room table, sharing inside jokes about their weekend getaway that you're supposedly too naive to understand. Now imagine that same husband 6 months later, standing in an empty office with eviction papers in his hand, realizing that the woman who served him dinner every night actually owned the building he'd been working in all along. The woman he dismissed as a simple housewife had quietly become his landlord, his business rival, and ultimately, his biggest mistake. That woman was me. And if you think cheating husbands and manipulative secretaries always win, you're about to discover just how wrong you can be. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Sarah Mitchell, though for the past 5 years, I've been known primarily as David Mitchell's wife, and before that, simply as Sarah Williams from a small Wisconsin town where women learned early that their dreams were nice hobbies until marriage made them unnecessary. At 38, I can finally say that identity crisis is over. But the journey to reclaim my name and my power nearly destroyed me before it set me free. The story I'm about to tell you began long before I ever met David. Long before I understood what it meant to love someone who saw you as an accessory rather than an equal. And definitely long before I learned that sometimes the most devastating betrayals come wrapped in silk ties and presented with charming smiles over candlelit dinners. In your own home. Growing up in Millbrook, Wisconsin, a town where the population of 8,400 people felt both suffocating and comforting depending on the day, I learned that women had 2 acceptable paths: marry well or work temporarily until you married. Well, my mother, Linda Williams, had chosen the first option, trading her dreams of teaching elementary school for a part-time position at Millbrook Community Bank, where she spent 25 years making coffee, filing papers, and smiling apologetically whenever she had to ask my father for permission to buy anything more expensive than groceries. Linda Williams was beautiful in that understated way that small-town women perfect. Hair always neat, makeup subtle but present, clothes practical but feminine. She moved through our house like a ghost sometimes, cleaning up after my father and my brother Mike without complaint, her artistic tendencies surfacing only in the way she arranged flowers from our garden, or the elaborate birthday cakes she'd create from scratch, decorated with roses made from frosting that took her hours to perfect. My father, Robert Williams, worked as a supervisor at the Millbrook manufacturing plant, a job that provided steady income and, more importantly to him, unquestioned authority at home. Robert was the kind of man who believed that his paycheck bought him the right to make every major decision for our family, from where we took our annual vacation to whether my mother could take art classes at the community center. He wasn't cruel exactly, but he operated under the assumption that his opinion was fact and everyone else's perspective was merely suggestion. Sunday dinners at the Williams house followed the same pattern for 18 years. Dad would carve the roast while delivering his weekly wisdom about life, work, and the proper order of things. Women who worked full-time were neglecting their families. Women who pursued careers instead of marriage were selfish. Women who earned more than their husbands were emasculating their men. These weren't discussions. They were pronouncements delivered with the confidence of someone who had never questioned whether his worldview might be incomplete. My older sister Jenny had absorbed these lessons perfectly. She'd been a gifted nursing student at UW-Madison, earning top grades and praise from her clinical instructors. But she dropped out in her junior year when she met Tom, a local insurance agent who convinced her that love was more important than some diploma. They married when she was 21, and Jenny transformed from a confident young woman who could start an IV in her sleep into someone who asked Tom's opinion before buying a new shade of lipstick. Watching Jenny's transformation terrified me, though I couldn't articulate why at the time. She seemed happy enough, hosting dinner parties and volunteering at the church, but there was something in her eyes during family gatherings, a flicker of something that looked like regret when the conversation turned to careers or achievements outside of domestic success. When I'd ask her if she ever missed nursing, she'd smile brightly and change the subject. But I noticed she kept her old textbooks hidden in the basement, as if she couldn't quite bring herself to throw away that version of herself entirely. The person who understood my restlessness was my grandmother, Rose Williams, my father's mother, who lived with us from the time I was 12 until I left for college. Rose had been a talented seamstress in her youth, with dreams of opening her own boutique in Milwaukee, but pregnancy at 22 had ended those plans before they could begin. She'd spent the next 50 years altering wedding dresses and hemming pants for other women while raising 4 children and managing a household that never seemed to appreciate the artistry in her work. Rose would sit with me in her sewing room, surrounded by fabric and patterns, teaching me to create beautiful things with my hands while sharing stories about the dresses she'd designed that no one ever saw, the fashion magazines she'd hidden from my grandfather, the sketches she'd drawn in secret and eventually burned, because dreaming had begun to feel like betrayal of her duties as a wife and mother. "Sarah," she told me one afternoon as we worked on a dress for my junior prom, her fingers still nimble despite arthritis, "being smart is a gift, but being a smart woman in this world requires strategy. You can't just be brilliant. You have to be brilliant in ways that don't threaten the people around you, at least until you're strong enough to handle their reactions." I didn't understand what she meant then. I thought intelligence was enough, that good grades and ambition would naturally lead to opportunities and respect. I believed that the world had changed since my grandmother's generation, that women like me could pursue our dreams without having to choose between love and achievement. I was naive in the way that only young people who haven't yet been systematically disappointed can be. High school in Millbrook moved at the pace of seasons, predictable and slow. I threw myself into academics because learning felt like freedom, even within the constraints of our small-town curriculum. Math made sense in ways that social hierarchies didn't. Literature opened worlds that existed beyond the borders of Wisconsin. History showed me that change was possible, even if it happened slowly and often at great cost to the people brave enough to demand it. My grades were excellent, consistently placing me at the top of our small graduating class, but academic success in Millbrook carried different weight depending on your gender. When boys earned high grades, they were destined for important careers. When girls earned high grades, they were good catches for ambitious young men. The distinction was subtle, but absolute, and I felt it in every conversation about my future, that somehow became a conversation about my eventual marriage and children. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Dr. Walsh was everything I'd never imagined a woman could be professionally. Confident, respected, intellectually formidable, and completely uninterested in apologizing for her expertise. She wore tailored suits and spoke with authority about complex economic theories, and when male students challenged her in class, she responded with data and analysis that left them speechless rather than defensive. "Sarah," she told me after I'd presented a particularly detailed analysis of emerging market trends, "you have an instinct for recognizing undervalued assets, whether they're stocks, real estate, or opportunities. That's not a skill you can teach. It's a gift you can develop." Under Dr. Walsh's mentorship, I began to see myself as someone who could build wealth rather than simply marry into it. Someone who could create security through intelligence and hard work rather than hoping that attachment to the right man would provide it. She encouraged me to apply for internships at investment firms, to read financial publications beyond our course requirements, and to think about my career as something I was building rather than something I was preparing to abandon. The internship I secured during my junior year at Hartman & Associates, a small investment firm in Madison, changed everything. The work was intellectually challenging in ways that made me feel fully alive. Analyzing market trends, researching companies for potential investment, creating financial models that predicted how various factors would affect returns. I was good at it, genuinely gifted in ways that my supervisors noticed and praised. It was at Hartman & Associates that I met David Mitchell, though our love story began less romantically than I probably should have admitted to my family. David was 33. To my 23, an established attorney specializing in real estate law who frequently worked with our firm on property investment deals. He was handsome in a conventional way, tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that was just beginning to show silver at the temples, and brown eyes that seemed to take in everything around him with calculating intelligence. Our first conversation happened during a client meeting where I was presenting research on commercial real estate trends in the Madison area. David listened carefully to my analysis, asked thoughtful questions, and afterward approached me with what seemed like genuine, professional respect. That was impressive work, he told me as we gathered our papers after the meeting. Most people don't understand the correlation between demographic shifts and property values the way you explained it today. We began having coffee after joint meetings, conversations that started professionally but gradually became personal. David seemed different from the men I'd known in Millbrook or even the male students at university. He talked about my career goals as if they were legitimate, asked about my research projects with genuine interest, and never suggested that my ambitions were temporary or impractical. When I called home to tell my parents I was dating a lawyer, the response was immediately positive in ways that my academic achievements had never been. "A lawyer," my mother exclaimed, and I could hear the relief in her voice. "Sarah, that's wonderful. How old is he? Is he established in his career?" Dad's approval was even more emphatic. "Finally, honey, you found someone who can provide for you properly. Maybe now you can stop worrying about all this career business and focus on what really matters." The assumption that dating David meant abandoning my professional goals bothered me, but I told myself that my family simply didn't understand that modern relationships could include two successful careers. David certainly seemed to support my ambitions. He often bragged to his colleagues about his brilliant girlfriend and encouraged me to pursue the best opportunities available after graduation. We dated for 2 years while I finished my degree and began working full-time at Hartman & Associates. David was attentive and romantic, bringing me flowers after particularly stressful work weeks, taking me to expensive restaurants where he'd introduce me to his professional contacts as someone with real insights into financial markets. He seemed proud of my intelligence in ways that felt genuine, and I began to believe I'd found the rare man who could love a woman without needing to diminish her. The proposal came during my first year working full-time at a restaurant overlooking Lake Mendota on a beautiful October evening when the leaves were turning colors that reminded me of my grandmother's fabric collection. David had planned everything carefully: reservations at my favorite restaurant, a ring that showed he'd been paying attention to my preferences, and a speech about building a life together that included both our careers and our dreams. "Sarah," he said, holding my hands across the table as other diners pretended not to watch, "I want to spend my life with someone who challenges me intellectually, who has her own goals and passions, who makes me better just by being herself. Will you marry me?" I said yes, because I loved him, but also because I believed he meant those words, that he was proposing to the woman who analyzed investment portfolios and contributed to client presentations, not just the woman who looked good beside him at professional events. The engagement ring was beautiful, but more importantly, it felt like a promise that I could be both loved and respected, both a wife and a professional, both partnered and independent. Planning our wedding became a careful negotiation between the life I wanted and the expectations of our families. My parents wanted a traditional ceremony in Millbrook, while David's family preferred something more sophisticated in Madison. I wanted something small and elegant, while both mothers seemed determined to invite everyone they'd ever met. We compromised. On a medium-sized celebration at a historic inn near Madison. Beautiful but not ostentatious, formal but not overwhelming. The months leading up to our wedding in June 2018 were busy with professional demands as well as wedding planning. I'd been promoted to senior analyst at Hartman & Associates, managing my own client portfolios and earning recognition for consistently strong returns on investments. David's real estate practice was thriving, and he'd recently been offered a position at a larger, more prestigious firm in Madison. The guidance counselor, Mrs. Patterson, called me into her office during my senior year to discuss college applications. She spread brochures across her desk like a dealer revealing cards. But the schools she highlighted were all local, affordable, and known for programs that would prepare me for traditionally female careers: teaching, nursing, social work. When I mentioned my interest in business school, she smiled in the indulgent way adults use when children suggest impossible things. "Business is very competitive, Sarah," she explained, her tone gentle but firm. "And you're such a pretty girl. You might find that marriage offers more security than trying to climb corporate ladders that weren't really designed for women anyway." I left her office with a stack of applications for education programs and a growing determination to prove that her limitations weren't mine. That evening, I researched business schools on the library's single computer with internet access, printing pages about requirements and career prospects when the librarian wasn't watching. The University of Wisconsin-Madison had an excellent business program, and while the tuition seemed impossibly expensive, they offered academic scholarships for students with exceptional grades and test scores. Applying to UW-Madison became my secret project. I studied for the SATs using prep books I borrowed from the library in the next town over, drove myself to the testing center in Green Bay, and submitted my application using money I'd earned from babysitting jobs that my father assumed were just social activities. When the acceptance letter arrived with a partial scholarship offer, I hid it in my grandmother's sewing room until I found the courage to share the news. The conversation with my parents happened on a Tuesday evening in March. Dad was reading the local newspaper after dinner while Mom cleared the table, and I announced my college plans like I was ripping off a bandage, fast and without warning. "I've been accepted to UW-Madison," I said, placing the letter on the table beside his coffee cup. "Business administration program. I start in the fall." The silence that followed felt eternal. Dad set down his newspaper with deliberate care, reading the letter twice before looking at me with an expression I'd never seen before, something between disappointment and confusion. "Sarah, honey, this is a nice accomplishment," he began, his voice measured in the way that preceded lectures. "But business school is expensive, and frankly, it's not practical for a girl your age. You should be thinking about finding a good husband, not competing with men for jobs you don't really want." "How do you know what I want?" The question came out sharper than I'd intended, and I saw my mother freeze in the doorway between the kitchen and dining room. "Because I'm your father, and I know what makes women happy in the long run. Career ambitions might seem exciting now, but in 10 years, you'll want a family, and you'll regret wasting time and money on something that won't matter once you have children." My grandmother appeared in the hallway, still wearing her reading glasses, drawn by the tension in my father's voice. When she saw the letter in his hands, her expression shifted to something that looked like pride mixed with worry. "Robert," she said quietly, "perhaps we should consider what Sarah wants for herself." "Mother, with respect, your generation had limited options. Sarah has the luxury of choosing security over struggle, and as her father, it's my job to guide her toward decisions she won't regret." That night, I sat in Rose's sewing room while she hemmed a bridesmaid's dress for someone in town, her hands steady despite the tension that had filled our house since dinner. We didn't speak for a long time, but finally, she set down her needle and looked at me directly. "Your father loves you," she said, "but he loves you the way he understands love, which means protecting you from things he fears rather than preparing you for things you want. The question isn't whether you should go to college, Sarah. The question is whether you're brave enough to disappoint him in order to save yourself. The next morning, I told my parents I was accepting the scholarship and attending UW-Madison in the fall. Dad didn't speak to me for 3 days, and when he finally did, it was to establish rules about paying for college expenses he wouldn't cover, which turned out to be most of them. Mom cried privately but supported me publicly, and Jenny seemed confused by my choice to pursue something so uncertain when marriage offered such clear benefits. But my grandmother helped me pack, slipping a small envelope into my suitcase when she thought no one was looking. Later, in my dorm room, I discovered $500 in cash and a note written in her careful handwriting. For the dresses you'll design when you're brave enough to dream in public. Love, Rose. College felt like stepping into a larger version of myself, one that had been waiting for permission to exist. The University of Wisconsin-Madison was overwhelming at first, with more students in my freshman dorm than lived in all of Millbrook. But I adapted quickly to the pace and intensity of academic life that actually matched my capabilities. For the first time, being smart was an advantage rather than a social liability. I chose business administration with a focus on finance, drawn to the logic of markets and investment strategies that reminded me of the mathematical puzzles I'd loved in high school. My professors were demanding but encouraging, especially Dr. Patricia Walsh, who taught advanced economics and seemed to take particular interest in female students who showed aptitude for financial analysis. We seemed like the perfect couple to everyone around us: successful, attractive, supportive of each other's careers, and financially stable. At 28 and 33, we were old enough to be mature about marriage, but young enough to build a substantial life together. Friends joked that we were the couple they wanted to become, and family members used us as examples of how modern relationships could work when both people were committed to success. But even during those hopeful months, there were small signs that I chose to ignore. Tiny fissures in the foundation that I explained away because I wanted so badly to believe in the life we were building together. David would sometimes make jokes about letting me handle the money when we discussed our future finances, as if my professional expertise was charming rather than valuable. He'd introduce me at professional events as his fiancée before mentioning my career, a small shift in priority that felt significant, but that I told myself was just social convention. Most tellingly, he began suggesting that I might want to consider scaling back my work responsibilities after we married, not because he didn't value my career, but because managing both a demanding job and the social obligations of being a lawyer's wife might be overwhelming. When I pointed out that he wasn't planning to scale back his own career to accommodate marriage, he laughed and kissed my forehead in a way that felt condescending, even as he insisted it was affectionate. "That's different, sweetheart," he'd say. "My career supports our lifestyle. Yours is important to you personally, but we need to be practical about priorities." These conversations troubled me, but I convinced myself that we were just working through the normal adjustments that came with combining two lives into one partnership. David was older and more established in his career. It made sense that his professional obligations would take precedence initially. Once we were married and settled, I told myself, we'd find a better balance between his needs and mine. Our wedding day was beautiful in all the ways that mattered to other people. Perfect weather, gorgeous flowers, delicious food, and a celebration that felt both intimate and significant. I wore my grandmother's pearl necklace with a dress that made me feel elegant and confident, and David looked handsome in his tuxedo, smiling as if he'd won the lottery when I walked down the aisle. But even on what should have been the happiest day of my life, I felt a strange disconnection from the version of myself that everyone was celebrating. The bride they toasted was David's fiancée, the woman who would now be known as Mrs. Mitchell, who would host dinner parties and attend firm events and support her husband's career advancement. That woman seemed lovely and accomplished and destined for happiness. But she wasn't quite the same person who had analyzed market trends and built investment portfolios and dreamed of financial independence. I told myself that marriage meant compromise, that love required some sacrifice of individual identity for the sake of partnership, that I was overthinking changes that probably weren't as significant as they felt. After all, I was keeping my job, maintaining my own career, and marrying a man who claimed to value my intelligence and ambition. What I didn't understand yet was that there's a difference between a man who's attracted to your success and a man who's committed to supporting it, between someone who likes dating an accomplished woman and someone who's prepared to be married to one. The distinction would become clear soon enough, but on my wedding day, surrounded by flowers and champagne and congratulations, I believed I was beginning the best chapter of my life, rather than closing the book on the woman I'd been working so hard to become. Marriage to David felt like stepping into a beautifully appointed cage that I hadn't noticed being constructed around me. The changes didn't happen overnight, which made them easier to rationalize and harder to resist. During our engagement, David had been proud of my analytical mind and professional accomplishments. As his wife, those same qualities gradually transformed, from assets into inconveniences that needed managing. Our honeymoon in Tuscany should have been perfect. David had planned every detail meticulously, from the vineyard tours to the cooking classes, and for 2 weeks we existed in a bubble of romance that felt like a preview of our life together. But even then, small moments revealed the shift that was already beginning. When we visited local markets, I would naturally calculate exchange rates and negotiate prices with vendors, skills that had served me well in business. David would watch, with an expression I couldn't quite read, then gently take over conversations as if my participation embarrassed him. "Let me handle this, sweetheart," became his frequent refrain, accompanied by an apologetic smile to strangers as if my competence required explanation. Sarah's very analytical, but these situations need a different approach. I told myself he was protecting me from the stress of navigating foreign transactions, that his intervention came from love rather than condescension. It was easier to believe that than to acknowledge what I was seeing. My new husband preferred me ornamental rather than functional, beautiful rather than brilliant. Returning to Madison after our honeymoon meant returning to the reality of combining 2 established lives into one shared existence. We'd purchased a house in Maple Bluff, an upscale neighborhood where David's colleagues lived with their families. The house was gorgeous, a 1920s colonial with hardwood floors and built-in bookshelves, but it felt like a stage set for the life David imagined we'd live rather than a home that reflected both our personalities. Moving in together revealed how differently we approached practical decisions. I wanted to create a home office where I could work in the evenings and weekends, analyzing market trends and preparing client presentations. David suggested that the spare bedroom would be better used as a guest room for the entertaining we'd be doing as an established couple. When I protested that my work required dedicated space, he smiled indulgently and offered to clear a corner of his home office for my projects. The word projects stung in ways I couldn't fully articulate. My career wasn't a hobby or a creative outlet. It was a profession that required focus, research, and uninterrupted time to produce quality analysis. But David's dismissal felt so gentle, wrapped in such reasonable-sounding logic, that arguing seemed petty and ungrateful. "Of course, your work is important, honey," he'd say when I tried to explain my frustration. "But we need to be practical about space and priorities. My office is set up for serious business already, and sharing makes sense economically." Sharing his office meant working around his schedule, using his equipment when it was available, and constantly feeling like a guest in space that was supposed to be partially mine. David's legal documents took priority on the desk. His law books filled the shelves, and his diplomas and awards covered the walls. My financial reports and market analyses lived in a single filing cabinet that David had grudgingly cleared for my use. The physical space became a metaphor for our entire relationship. I existed in the margins of David's life, important enough to be included, but not significant enough to require equal accommodation. When I worked late in his office, He'd check on me with the solicitous air of someone monitoring a sick child, rather than a spouse pursuing her own career goals. "You're working too hard, Sarah," he'd say, massaging my shoulders as I reviewed portfolio performance reports. "Why don't you take a break and help me plan the dinner party for the Hendersons? That's more important than whatever you're calculating there." The assumption that his social obligations automatically became my priorities grated against everything I'd been taught about marriage as partnership. But David's suggestions always sounded reasonable in isolation, and my resistance began to feel unreasonable in response. Wasn't compromise essential to successful marriage? Wasn't supporting my husband's career advancement good for both of us? Wasn't I being selfish by prioritizing my own work over our shared social responsibilities? These internal negotiations became exhausting. Every request David made seemed logical and loving, but the cumulative effect was the gradual erosion of the professional identity I'd spent years building. I was still working at Hartman & Associates, still managing client portfolios and earning recognition for strong performance. But increasingly, my job felt like something I did between my real responsibilities as David's wife. The social expectations of being married to an ambitious attorney were more demanding than I'd anticipated. David's law firm operated like a small society with elaborate hierarchies and unwritten rules about spousal behavior. Partners' wives were expected to attend monthly dinners, organize charity events, and maintain the kind of social relationships that supported their husband's professional advancement. Margaret Henderson, wife of the senior partner, took me under her wing with the benevolent authority of someone accustomed to instructing younger women in proper behavior. Margaret was 55, impeccably dressed, and utterly confident in her role as the firm's unofficial social coordinator. She'd been beautiful once, and remained striking in the way that well-maintained wealth allows, but her intelligence had been channeled entirely into managing her husband's career and their family's social position. "Sarah, dear," she told me during my first partner's wives' lunch, "the key to supporting David's success is understanding that everything we do reflects on our husbands' reputations. We're not just wives, we're partners in their professional image." The lunch took place at the country club where David and I would later have our most devastating confrontation, though I didn't know that yet. Margaret had arranged the gathering to introduce me to the other wives and explain my new responsibilities as David's spouse. The women were uniformly polished, uniformly charming, and uniformly focused on topics that had nothing to do with their own careers or interests. They discussed charity committees with the intensity that I brought to financial analysis, debating flower arrangements and catering choices as if these decisions would determine the fate of the firm. When Margaret asked about my background, I mentioned my work at Hartman & Associates, explaining briefly that I specialized in investment analysis for small portfolios. The response was politely dismissive. "How interesting," said Catherine Wells, whose husband was a senior associate. "But you'll find that managing David's career demands will probably require all your attention." Michael's practice grew so quickly after we married that I had to give up my little bookkeeping job just to keep up with the social calendar. The phrase "little bookkeeping job" dismissed years of education and professional development with casual cruelty. I wanted to explain that financial analysis required sophisticated mathematical skills and deep understanding of market psychology, that my recommendations had helped clients achieve significant returns on their investments, that my work was intellectually challenging in ways that flower arrangement probably wasn't. Instead, I smiled politely and listened as Margaret outlined my expected contributions to the firm's social calendar. I would co-chair the annual charity auction with 2 other junior wives. I would host the quarterly dinner party for new associates and their spouses. I would join the book club that met monthly to discuss novels chosen specifically for their lack of controversial content. "Don't worry," Margaret assured me as lunch concluded. "The other wives will help you learn everything you need to know. Being a lawyer's wife is really a full-time job once you understand how to do it properly." Driving home from that lunch, I felt disoriented in ways that were difficult to name. The women had been kind and welcoming, their advice well-intentioned, and probably accurate about the demands I'd face as David's wife. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just been inducted into a society that required me to pretend my own education and achievements were irrelevant to my new identity. That evening, I tried to discuss my concerns with David over dinner. He listened carefully as I described the lunch and my confusion about balancing professional work with social obligations, then offered what he clearly considered helpful perspective. "Margaret's right about the importance of firm social events," he said, cutting his steak with careful precision. "Partners notice whose wives are engaged with the community and whose are too busy with their own interests to support the team. It's not fair, maybe, but it's reality in law firm culture." "But what about my reality?" I asked, hearing the frustration in my own voice. "I have clients depending on my analysis, portfolios that need monitoring, research projects that require follow-through. I can't just abandon my professional responsibilities because your colleagues' wives think charity committees are more important than actual careers." David's expression shifted to something I recognized, but had never directed at me before. The patient condescension he used with difficult clients who didn't understand legal complexities. "Sarah, honey, your career is important to you, and I respect that. But we need to be realistic about priorities. My advancement at the firm affects both our futures financially. Your investment work, while admirable, doesn't have the same impact on our long-term security." The logic was sound enough to make arguing difficult, but the underlying assumption felt like betrayal. My career had become secondary, not because it was less valuable objectively, but because it was less valuable to our marriage in David's estimation. The woman he'd courted for her intelligence and ambition was now expected to subordinate those qualities to his professional needs. Sleep became elusive that night, as I lay beside David listening to his peaceful breathing and trying to reconcile the man I'd married with the man who seemed to view my professional life as a dispensable luxury. I'd always assumed that marriage meant building something together, combining our strengths and supporting each other's goals. Instead, I was discovering that marriage, at least to David, meant aligning myself with his vision of our shared future, whether or not that vision included room for my individual aspirations. The next morning brought an email from Dr. Walsh, my former professor, who was organizing a panel discussion about women in finance for the university's business school. She wanted me to participate as a representative of young professionals successfully building careers in investment analysis. The invitation felt like a lifeline, a reminder that my professional identity existed independent of my role as David's wife. When I mentioned the opportunity to David over breakfast, his response revealed how completely our dynamic had shifted since marriage. "A panel discussion sounds like a nice honor," he said, not looking up from his newspaper. "But check with Margaret first about scheduling. I think the Charity Auction Planning Committee has meetings that week, and those take priority for firm wives." The casual dismissal of an academic opportunity in favor of party planning struck me as so absurd that I initially thought David was joking. When I realized he was serious, something crystallized in my understanding of our relationship that I'd been avoiding for months. "David," I said carefully, "this isn't just a nice honor. It's professional recognition from my former professors. An opportunity to share insights about market analysis with students who are considering careers in finance. It's exactly the kind of speaking engagement that demonstrates expertise in my field." He set down his newspaper and looked at me with the expression I was learning to dread. Sympathetic, but firm, as if he was explaining difficult concepts to someone who wasn't quite smart enough to understand them naturally. "Sarah, I understand that you're proud of your financial knowledge, and you should be. But we need to think strategically about how you spend your time and energy. Academic panels don't advance our shared goals the way firm social obligations do." "Our shared goals?" The phrase escaped before I could moderate my tone. "When did my professional development stop being one of our shared goals?" "When you became my wife," David answered with stunning directness. "Marriage means partnership. And partnership means prioritizing activities that benefit both of us, rather than pursuing individual interests that might conflict with our broader objectives. The conversation ended there because I couldn't trust myself to respond without saying things that would damage our relationship beyond repair. But David's words echoed in my mind for days afterward, particularly his characterization of my career as individual interest rather than professional obligation, and his assumption that activities benefiting him automatically benefited both of us, while activities benefiting me required justification. I declined Dr. Walsh's invitation and attended my first charity auction planning meeting instead, sitting in Margaret Henderson's elegantly appointed living room discussing centerpiece options with women who spoke about table decorations with the seriousness I reserved for market volatility analysis. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was using my analytical skills to optimize flower arrangements rather than investment portfolios, but pointing out the absurdity would only confirm everyone's suspicion that I didn't understand my proper role in their social ecosystem. The transformation from independent professional to corporate wife happened gradually, like learning a new language through immersion rather than formal instruction. Nobody handed me a manual explaining how to subordinate my own ambitions to my husband's career advancement, but the lessons were consistent and clear once I learned to recognize them. The rules revealed themselves through 1,000 small corrections and subtle redirections. When I mentioned clients or market trends during dinner parties, conversations would politely shift to topics more appropriate for mixed company. When I offered professional insights during business discussions, my contributions were acknowledged, with the kind of indulgent attention reserved for precocious children who didn't understand they were interrupting adult conversations. Most painfully, David himself became the primary enforcer of these unwritten codes. The man who had once bragged about his brilliant girlfriend now seemed embarrassed when I demonstrated the intelligence he'd supposedly fallen in love with. Public displays of my professional competence became sources of marital tension that we'd discuss privately, in tones of loving concern for my social adjustment. "Sarah, sweetheart," he'd say after I'd corrected someone's misunderstanding of interest rate fluctuations during a dinner party. "You were right about the Federal Reserve policy, but you made Thomas look foolish in front of his wife." These social situations require diplomacy more than accuracy. The message was clear. Being right mattered less than making others comfortable, and making others comfortable meant allowing them to remain wrong rather than offering corrections that might bruise their egos. My education and expertise became tools I was expected to keep sheathed in social situations, brought out only when specifically requested and wielded with enough gentle hesitation to avoid challenging anyone's assumptions about their own knowledge. Learning to perform intellectual modesty was exhausting in ways I hadn't anticipated. Every conversation required careful calibration of how much intelligence to display, how many insights to offer, how extensively to explain concepts I understood intuitively. Too much knowledge made others uncomfortable. Too little made David question why he'd married someone so passive. Finding the perfect balance of smart but not threatening, informed but not pedantic, became a constant source of anxiety. The charity auction planning provided my crash course in the social dynamics that governed wives in David's professional circle. Margaret Henderson ran committee meetings with the efficiency of a corporate board, but the decisions we made concerned fundraising strategies for children's literacy programs rather than profit maximization for shareholders. The irony of watching brilliant women apply sophisticated organizational skills to relatively trivial objectives wasn't lost on me, but commenting on it would have violated the unspoken agreement that our volunteer work was both vitally important and completely separate from serious business. Catherine Wells emerged as my unofficial guide to navigating these complexities. At 34, she'd been married to her attorney husband for 8 years and had perfected the art of being impressively competent without appearing professionally ambitious. Catherine possessed a law degree from Northwestern, but had never practiced, channeling her legal training into volunteer positions that enhanced her husband's reputation without competing with his career trajectory. The secret, she explained during one of our coffee meetings to discuss auction logistics, is understanding that we're not just supporting our husbands individually. We're maintaining the entire social structure that allows their firm to function effectively. When clients see that the partners have stable, accomplished wives who manage their families and social obligations beautifully, it reinforces confidence in the firm's reliability and success. Catherine's analysis was shrewd and probably accurate, but it reduced my existence to a supporting role in someone else's performance, rather than recognizing my own potential for professional achievement. I was becoming a prop in David's career. Advancement, carefully styled and positioned to enhance his image without distracting from his accomplishments. The book club represented the intellectual component of my new social obligations, though the books we read were chosen specifically to avoid controversial topics that might create awkward disagreements among members. We discussed romance novels and popular fiction with the same analytical intensity I'd once brought to quarterly earnings reports, parsing character motivations and thematic elements with sufficient depth to demonstrate our education without approaching subjects that might reveal fundamental differences in political or philosophical perspectives. Sarah Chen, wife of a junior partner, had a PhD in literature from Yale, but limited her contributions to discussions of narrative structure and stylistic techniques rather than offering interpretations that might challenge more conservative members' worldviews. Watching Sarah carefully moderate her intellectual engagement to maintain group harmony felt like witnessing my own future. Brilliant women systematically diminishing themselves to preserve social cohesion. "It's not censorship," Sarah explained when I asked her privately about the book selection process. "It's strategic relationship management. These women's husbands work together every day, and maintaining friendly relationships among the wives prevents personal conflicts from affecting professional collaborations. My literary opinions matter less than the firm's stability." The logic was rational but depressing. Every intellectual compromise served the larger goal of supporting our husbands' careers, which supposedly benefited all of us financially and socially. But the cumulative effect was the gradual erosion of the qualities that had made us interesting enough to marry successful men in the first place. We were becoming interchangeable accessories rather than individual partners, valued for our ability to enhance our husbands' images rather than for our own accomplishments or perspectives. My work at Hartman & Associates provided temporary refuge from the suffocating social expectations of being David's wife. But even there, I began to feel the pressure of divided loyalties. Client meetings that ran late conflicted with dinner, parties I was expected to host. Research projects that required weekend work interfered with social obligations that David considered essential to his career advancement. "Sarah, I need you to prioritize," became David's frequent refrain when my professional responsibilities conflicted with his social calendar. "The Morrison wedding reception is important for firm relationships. Your client review meeting can be rescheduled, but missing Thomas Morrison's daughter's wedding would be noticed and remembered." Each compromise felt reasonable in isolation, but devastating in accumulation. I was gradually ceding control over my own schedule to accommodate David's professional needs, subordinating my client obligations to his social requirements, and learning to view my career as a flexible hobby rather than a serious commitment. The most painful part of this transformation was how natural it began to feel. After months of moderating my contributions to conversations, I found myself genuinely uncertain about my own expertise. After countless redirections away from professional topics, I began to question whether my insights were actually valuable or just inappropriately timed. The confident financial analyst who had impressed clients with her market knowledge was being replaced by someone who constantly second-guessed her right to participate in substantive discussions. David's approval became the primary measure of my social performance, and his standards were both demanding and contradictory. He wanted me to be impressive enough to enhance his reputation, but not so impressive that I overshadowed him. He valued my intelligence but expected me to deploy it in service of his goals rather than my own. He was proud of my accomplishments, but uncomfortable when they became the focus of attention in social situations. Perfect balance, he'd tell me after successful dinner parties where I'd charmed his colleagues without challenging them, supported his professional image without competing for attention, and demonstrated my education without appearing to know more than anyone else in the room. You're learning to be the kind of wife who advances both our interests. The phrase, both our interests, had become meaningless because my interests were now defined entirely in relation to David's success. What I wanted professionally, intellectually, or personally mattered only insofar as it aligned with or supported what he needed to advance his career. I was disappearing into our marriage, becoming a satellite orbiting his ambitions rather than a partner with my own trajectory. By our first anniversary, I had mastered the art of being David's wife in public, while privately mourning the professional woman I'd been before marriage. The celebration itself embodied this contradiction perfectly. An elegant dinner party at our home where I played the gracious hostess while my husband received congratulations for his recent promotion to junior partner. Guests praised my organizational skills and my ability to create a warm, welcoming atmosphere, but nobody mentioned my work or asked about my professional goals. I had become invisible in plain sight, valued for my performance as David's wife, rather than recognized for my own achievements. The promotion David had received came partly as a result of research I had conducted on property law changes that affected the firm's real estate practice. When he'd mentioned struggling with a complex zoning issue for a major client, I'd spent my weekend researching municipal codes and regulatory precedents, creating a comprehensive analysis that provided the solution he needed. David had presented my work to the partners as his own insight, earning praise for his thoroughness and strategic thinking that contributed to his advancement. Watching him accept congratulations for research I had conducted felt like watching someone else receive credit for my children's achievements. The work was mine in every meaningful sense. I had identified the relevant statutes, analyzed their implications, and crafted the argument that solved the client's problem. But David had the relationships and platform to present the solution. And in the firm's hierarchy, presentation mattered more than preparation. I couldn't have done it without Sarah's support, David told the partners when they praised his innovative approach to the zoning challenge. The comment was technically accurate but practically meaningless, reducing my intellectual contribution to emotional encouragement rather than acknowledging the substantive research that had made his success possible. Margaret Henderson approached me during the anniversary dinner, wine glass in hand, and approval shining in her eyes like a benediction. "Sarah, dear, you've done such a wonderful job adapting to your role here. David is so fortunate to have a wife who understands how to support his career properly. Some of the younger wives struggle with the transition from working girl to professional spouse, but you've managed it beautifully." The phrase working girl stung with its dismissive diminutive, reducing my career to a temporary phase rather than acknowledging it as a legitimate professional identity. But Margaret's approval carried real social currency in David's world, and her validation of my performance as his wife provided security in my new role, even as it confirmed the death of my old one. Thomas Morrison, the senior partner whose daughter's wedding had taken precedence over my client meetings, joined our conversation with the expansive bonhomie of someone celebrating a successful evening. "David's lucky to have found someone who brings out his best qualities," Thomas observed, raising his glass in my direction. "Smart wives make smart husbands even smarter, and it shows in his work lately." The zoning analysis he presented last month was exactly the kind of innovative thinking we need from our junior partners. Standing in my own living room, listening to the senior partner praise my husband for my research while toasting me for making it possible, I experienced a moment of such profound disconnection from reality that I wondered if I was living someone else's life by mistake. The woman who had analyzed investment portfolios and advised clients on market strategies had been replaced by someone who enabled her husband's career advancement through invisible intellectual labor that he could claim as his own inspiration. The evening ended with guests praising our perfect marriage and David's promising career trajectory. but I cleaned up afterward feeling like I'd attended my own funeral. The professional woman I'd worked so hard to become was being systematically erased, replaced by a wife whose value lay entirely in her ability to enhance someone else's success without seeking recognition for her own contributions. Late that night, as David slept peacefully beside me, I found myself staring at the ceiling and trying to remember what it had felt like to be valued for my own mind rather than for my ability to support someone else's ambitions. The woman who had impressed professors and clients with her analytical insights was disappearing, and I wasn't sure how to retrieve her without destroying the marriage I'd built instead. My work at Hartman & Associates increasingly felt like acting in a play, where I was the only person who remembered the original script. My colleagues still respected my professional abilities, but I found myself apologizing for schedule conflicts created by David's social obligations and declining opportunities that might interfere with my duties as his wife. The confident analyst, who had once pursued challenging projects, was being replaced by someone who constantly negotiated between professional commitments and marital expectations. "Sarah, you seem distracted lately," observed my supervisor, Janet Murphy, during my annual performance review. "Your work quality remains excellent, but you've turned down several high-profile assignments that would have advanced your career. Is everything all right with your professional goals?" The question forced me to confront how thoroughly my priorities had shifted since marriage. The assignments I'd declined would have required extensive travel or evening work that conflicted with David's social calendar. The professional development opportunities I'd avoided would have increased my visibility in ways that might have attracted job offers requiring David to consider my career in his own planning. I was systematically limiting my own advancement to avoid creating complications for his. "I'm just trying to balance work with other commitments," I explained, hoping Janet wouldn't pursue the topic further. "Marriage requires some adjustments to professional priorities." Janet studied me with the expression of someone who recognized a familiar pattern but couldn't intervene directly. At 55, she had built her career during an era when women's professional advancement required even more strategic navigation than it did now, and she'd seen talented young women gradually disappear into supporting roles for their husbands' careers. "Sarah, I've seen many brilliant women make themselves smaller to accommodate their marriages," she said carefully. "Sometimes those accommodations become permanent in ways they never intended. Just make sure you're choosing your compromises, rather than letting them choose you." Her warning resonated with concerns I'd been suppressing for months, but acting on those concerns would have required confronting David about expectations I'd already agreed to meet. The social calendar we'd committed to, the firm obligations I'd accepted, the role I'd learned to perform as his wife. Challenging any of these would have disrupted the carefully constructed image of our successful marriage that had become central to David's professional advancement. Instead, I threw myself into charity work with the same analytical intensity I'd once brought to financial planning, hoping that applying my skills to volunteer organizations would provide some outlet for the intellectual energy I could no longer direct toward my own career. The Literacy Foundation, where I'd agreed to serve on the board, was struggling with budget allocation issues that my financial background made me uniquely qualified to address. "Sarah has such a gift for numbers," Margaret Henderson announced, when I presented a reorganization plan that would increase the foundation's efficiency by 30% while reducing administrative costs. "It's wonderful when wives can use their talents to benefit the community instead of just pursuing personal career advancement." The comment encapsulated everything wrong with my situation. My professional skills were valuable enough to solve complex organizational problems, but somehow inappropriate for pursuing my own advancement. I was expected to donate my expertise to causes that enhanced my husband's social standing, while abandoning the career that had developed those skills in the first place. The foundation work was fulfilling in ways that reminded me what it felt like to be respected for my analytical abilities, but it also highlighted how much I missed the intellectual challenges and financial rewards of professional employment. Volunteer positions provided social approval, but no independent income, community recognition but no career advancement, intellectual engagement but no professional autonomy. David praised my volunteer work with the same patronizing affection he'd begun using for all my activities outside our marriage. "I'm so proud of how you've channeled your business skills into community service," he told me after the foundation's annual report highlighted my contributions to their financial restructuring. "It's exactly the kind of meaningful work that makes a real difference in people's lives." The implication that my previous career hadn't made a real difference in people's lives was both subtle and devastating. The clients whose portfolios I'd managed and whose returns I'd improved had apparently not qualified as people whose lives mattered, while the charity beneficiaries whose programs I was now optimizing represented meaningful human impact. My professional work had been reduced to selfish ambition, while my volunteer service was elevated to noble sacrifice. 2 years into our marriage, I had become everything David wanted in a wife, and nothing I'd ever wanted in myself. The transformation was so complete that even I sometimes forgot the woman I'd been before, the confident professional who had built her own client base and earned recognition for innovative analytical approaches. That woman existed now only in the margins of my current life, surfacing briefly when foundation work required financial expertise or when dinner party conversations accidentally turned to topics where my education remained relevant. The most painful part of my diminishment was how natural it had become to everyone around us, including myself. Friends and family praised our marriage as a model of successful partnership, pointing to David's career advancement and our beautiful home and active social life as evidence that we'd found the perfect balance between love and ambition. Nobody mentioned that the balance had been achieved entirely through my sacrifices rather than through genuine compromise between equal partners. My mother called frequently to express her pride in how well I'd adjusted to married life, apparently oblivious to the fact that adjustment had required abandoning the professional aspirations she'd quietly supported throughout my education. "Sarah, honey, you've created such a lovely life with David," she said during one of our weekly conversations. "Your father was right about finding security through marriage rather than trying to compete in careers that weren't really designed for women anyway." The comment revealed how thoroughly my family had rewritten the narrative of my choices, transforming my professional achievements into youthful experiments that had naturally concluded with marriage to an appropriate man. My business degree and work experience were now viewed as qualifications that had helped me attract a successful husband, rather than foundations for my own career development. Even my grandmother Rose, who had encouraged my educational ambitions, despite family pressure, seemed to accept my new role as inevitable and appropriate. "Marriage requires sacrifices from both partners," she told me during a rare private conversation when she visited for the holidays. "The important thing is making sure those sacrifices serve love rather than just convention." But Rose's eyes held a sadness when she looked at me that reminded me of photographs from her youth, before pregnancy had ended her dreams of opening a boutique. She recognized the expression of someone who had chosen security over ambition, even if that choice had been presented as love rather than economic necessity. David's success continued to accelerate, built partly on the foundation of my invisible intellectual labor and partly on the social capital my performance as his wife provided within the firm's hierarchical culture. His promotion to junior partner had come with increased responsibilities, higher income, and greater expectations for social engagement that required even more of my time and energy to maintain properly. The dinner parties we hosted became more elaborate and frequent, requiring careful coordination of guest lists, menu planning, and conversation management that ensured David's colleagues left with enhanced impressions of his sophistication and reliability. I had become expert at orchestrating evenings that showcased David's wit and wisdom, while keeping my own contributions invisible but essential, like a stage manager who made productions run smoothly without ever appearing in the calm spotlight. "Sarah makes it look effortless," Margaret Henderson observed after a particularly successful dinner party for the firm's biggest clients. The mark of a truly accomplished hostess is making guests feel welcomed and entertained without ever noticing. How much work went into creating that experience? The praise was genuine and well-intended, but it emphasized my mastery of skills that existed solely to support someone else's professional objectives, rather than developing abilities that might advance my own goals. I was becoming increasingly competent at activities that made me increasingly invisible as an independent person with separate ambitions and interests. My work at Hartman & Associates had become a part-time commitment that I maintained primarily to preserve some connection to professional identity, though my reduced availability had limited my advancement opportunities and decreased my value to the firm. Janet Murphy continued to assign me projects when my schedule allowed, but she'd stopped offering the challenging assignments that required significant time commitment or travel obligations. "I understand your priorities have shifted," she told me with diplomatic kindness during a conversation about my reduced role. "Family obligations are important, and not everyone needs to pursue aggressive career advancement. There's value in maintaining professional skills even if you're not seeking promotion." Her understanding felt like a consolation prize for abandoning ambitions I'd once considered essential to my identity. The woman who had dreamed of building her own client base and developing expertise in emerging markets was now grateful for part-time work that kept her credentials current without interfering with her husband's career trajectory. The financial implications of my reduced professional commitment were masked by David's increasing income, but I found myself in the vulnerable position of economic dependence that I'd sworn to avoid when I first entered the business world. My own earnings had become supplementary rather than essential, discretionary rather than necessary, and my professional identity had correspondingly diminished in importance to our shared financial security. David managed our finances with the same control he exercised over our social calendar, making decisions about investments and major purchases while consulting me only about household expenses and charitable contributions. My expertise in financial analysis was utilized when he needed research for client projects, but ignored when it came to managing our own portfolio or planning our financial future. "I handle the serious money decisions," he'd explain when I questioned his investment choices or suggested alternative approaches to our retirement planning. "Your input is valuable, but I have more experience with complex financial strategies." The irony that my formal education in finance and professional experience in investment analysis somehow qualified me to research strategies for his clients, but not to participate in decisions about our own financial future, was lost on David entirely. My knowledge was useful when it served his professional purposes, but irrelevant when it came to exercising authority over our shared resources. The isolation I felt within our marriage was exacerbated by the social circle that had formed around David's career advancement. The other wives in our group were uniformly supportive of the lifestyle we'd all chosen, enthusiastic about the volunteer work and social obligations that filled our days, and genuinely satisfied with the trade-offs they'd made between personal ambition and family stability. Catherine Wells had become my closest friend among the lawyers' wives, but even she seemed incapable of understanding my growing restlessness with our carefully circumscribed existence. "Sarah, you have everything any woman could want," she pointed out when I attempted to express my frustration with the limitations of volunteer work compared to professional employment. "A successful husband who loves you, a beautiful home, financial security, and meaningful ways to contribute to the community. Why would you want to complicate that with career stress and office politics?" Her question revealed the fundamental difference in how we understood fulfillment and success. Catherine viewed professional achievement as external validation that paled in comparison to domestic happiness, while I was beginning to realize that domestic happiness built entirely on the suppression of individual ambition felt like a beautiful prison rather than genuine contentment. The growing resentment I felt toward David was complicated by the fact that he had never explicitly forbidden me to pursue professional goals. Instead, He had simply created expectations and obligations that made serious career advancement impossible, while maintaining the illusion that I was choosing family over ambition, rather than being systematically prevented from pursuing both. "I would never tell you what to do with your career, Sarah," he'd say when I occasionally expressed frustration with my reduced professional role. "But I hope you understand that marriage requires prioritizing our shared goals over individual desires that might conflict with family stability." His language was careful and loving, but the underlying message was clear. My professional ambitions were individual desires that threatened our family's well-being, while his career advancement served shared goals that benefited both of us. I was expected to sacrifice my own professional development for the greater good of our marriage, while he pursued his own advancement as a family obligation rather than personal choice. The most devastating part of this gradual erosion of my professional identity was how completely I had internalized the logic that made it seem reasonable and necessary. After 2 years of constant reinforcement that David's career took priority because it provided our financial security, that his social obligations were our shared responsibilities because they advanced our mutual interests, and that my professional goals were individual preferences that could be deferred for the sake of family harmony, I had begun to believe that choosing myself over our marriage would be selfish and destructive. The moment I understood that my marriage was built on a foundation of systematic deception rather than mutual respect came on a Tuesday evening in October, exactly 3 years after our wedding. I had spent the day volunteering at the Literacy Foundation, reviewing budget proposals with the same analytical rigor I'd once applied to client portfolios, when David called to inform me that he was bringing home a guest for dinner. "Emma Rodriguez is joining us tonight," he announced without preamble, his voice carrying the casual authority of someone accustomed to having his requests accommodated without question. "She's the new paralegal at the firm, fresh out of college. And I thought it would be nice to include her in some social activities to help her adjust to professional life in Madison." The request itself seemed reasonable enough. David occasionally brought colleagues home for informal dinners, and I had learned to maintain our freezer and pantry in a state of perpetual readiness for unexpected guests. What struck me as unusual was the careful way he explained Emma's background and his motivations for inviting her, as if he were preemptively addressing questions I hadn't asked. "Of course," I replied automatically, already mentally reviewing our refrigerator contents and planning a menu that could be elevated from casual to impressive with minimal additional shopping. "What time should I expect you both?" 7:30, David said, then added with uncharacteristic specificity, "And Sarah, Emma's quite young and probably intimidated by successful professional couples. Try to make her feel comfortable and included, rather than overwhelming her with too much career talk or financial analysis." The instruction to avoid career talk seemed oddly pointed, given that my professional background had become so thoroughly subordinated to my role as David's wife that I rarely mentioned it in social situations anyway. But his concern for Emma's comfort struck me as unusually thoughtful for a man who typically focused on how social interactions might benefit his own networking rather than on the emotional needs of junior colleagues. I spent the afternoon preparing a dinner that would impress without appearing effortful: herb-crusted salmon with roasted vegetables, and a chocolate tart that looked professionally made but could be assembled while managing conversation. The dining room was set with our wedding china and the good silver, candles arranged to create warm lighting that would flatter everyone and encourage relaxed conversation. David arrived promptly at 7:30 with Emma Rodriguez in tow, and I understood immediately why he had felt compelled to provide so much context for her visit. Emma was 26 years old, strikingly beautiful in an understated way that suggested natural confidence rather than calculated presentation. And she possessed the kind of fresh enthusiasm that made everyone around her seem older and more settled by comparison. "Mrs. Mitchell," she said when David introduced us, extending her hand with a warm smile that seemed genuine rather than professionally polished. "Thank you so much for including me tonight. David has told me wonderful things about your hospitality and your work with local charities." The phrasing was perfectly appropriate, but something in the way she said David's name without the formal courtesy that junior colleagues typically maintained with senior attorneys suggested a level of familiarity that seemed unusual for a new employee. When David helped her remove her coat, his hand lingered briefly on her shoulder in a gesture that could have been simple politeness, but felt somehow more intimate than the situation required. During cocktails in our living room, I watched Emma navigate the conversation with social skills that seemed sophisticated for someone supposedly intimidated by professional couples. She asked thoughtful questions about my volunteer work, complimented our home with specific observations that demonstrated genuine attention to detail, and engaged David in discussions about legal practice that revealed considerable knowledge for someone supposedly fresh out of college. "I'm particularly interested in real estate law," Emma told us, accepting a second glass of wine with the relaxed confidence of someone completely comfortable in our home. "The intersection of property rights and economic development fascinates me, especially in growing markets like Madison, where zoning decisions can dramatically affect community development patterns." Her analysis was perceptive and well-informed, demonstrating familiarity with concepts that most paralegals would need months of training to understand. When I attempted to contribute observations about how property values reflected broader economic trends, David quickly redirected the conversation to Emma's educational background and her adjustment to life in Madison. "Emma's from Milwaukee, originally," he explained, his tone carrying the same protective quality he'd used when warning me not to overwhelm her with career talk. "She's still learning her way around the city and meeting people her own age. Perhaps you could recommend some social activities that might help her build friendships outside the office." The suggestion that I should help David's young colleague develop a social life seemed reasonable in theory but felt uncomfortable in practice. Emma Rodriguez appeared perfectly capable of managing her own social connections, and her interest in our dinner conversation seemed focused primarily on David rather than on expanding her circle of friends in Madison. Throughout dinner, I found myself observing their interaction with growing unease that I couldn't quite articulate. David was attentive to Emma in ways that went beyond simple politeness, refilling her wine glass before she asked, remembering details about her preferences that seemed unusually specific for a supervisor who had known her for only a few weeks, and seeking her opinion on topics that didn't directly relate to her professional responsibilities. "Emma has some interesting perspectives on municipal development policies," David said when the conversation turned to local politics. "Her insights about how younger residents view urban planning could be valuable for our clients who are working on residential developments." Emma's perspectives were indeed thoughtful and well-researched, but I noticed that David's praise for her insights was more enthusiastic than his typical response to my own contributions to professional discussions. When I offered complimentary observations about how demographic trends affected property investment patterns, David acknowledged my comments politely, but immediately returned his attention to Emma's analysis as if her amateur observations were more compelling than my professional expertise. The evening concluded with Emma expressing elaborate gratitude for our hospitality, and David insisting that we should repeat the dinner soon, perhaps making it a regular opportunity for Emma to experience the kind of sophisticated social environment that would advance her professional development. As I cleared dishes and listened to them make plans for future social interactions, I felt the first stirrings of suspicion that this dinner had served purposes beyond simple collegial mentorship. "She's lovely," I told David later as we prepared for bed, testing whether he would provide additional context for his obvious interest in Emma's welfare. "Very bright and articulate for someone supposedly intimidated by professional couples." "I may have overstated her nervousness," David admitted with a casualness that felt calculated. "Emma's actually quite confident and capable. I think she'll fit in very well with our social group, and she could probably benefit from exposure to successful women like Margaret Henderson and Catherine Wells." His suggestion that Emma should be integrated into our established social circle struck me as unusual, given that junior employees rarely participated in partners' social activities until they had proven themselves professionally over months or years. But David's enthusiasm for Emma's social development seemed disproportionate to his typical interest in mentoring young colleagues, and his assumption that our friends would welcome a paralegal into their exclusive group suggested a level of personal investment that exceeded normal professional courtesy. Over the following weeks, Emma Rodriguez became a surprisingly frequent presence in our social orbit. David invited her to firm events where junior staff typically weren't included, introduced her to clients who seemed charmed by her intelligence and enthusiasm, and began including her in after-work activities that blurred the boundaries between professional networking and personal friendship. "Emma's joining us for the Henderson dinner party," David announced one Thursday evening, referring to the monthly gathering at Margaret Henderson's home that represented the pinnacle of the firm's social hierarchy. "Margaret specifically requested that we bring her, actually. She was impressed by Emma's conversation at the charity auction and thinks she'd be a valuable addition to the Literacy Foundation Committee." The idea that Margaret Henderson had specifically requested Emma's presence seemed implausible, given Margaret's typically careful attention to social protocol and her resistance to including junior employees in senior-level social functions. But David's explanation was delivered with such confident authority that questioning it would have seemed petty and suspicious. Emma's integration into our social circle proceeded with remarkable efficiency, as if she had been preparing for this level of sophisticated interaction rather than stumbling into it accidentally through David's mentorship. She contributed meaningfully to charity discussions, charmed the senior partners' wives with her combination of intelligence and deference, and positioned herself as someone who enhanced rather than threatened the established social dynamics. More troubling was how naturally she seemed to fit into the space beside David at social functions, engaging him in conversations that excluded me through their focus on legal concepts and office dynamics that I couldn't contribute to meaningfully. When I attempted to join their discussions, Emma would politely acknowledge my presence while subtly redirecting the conversation back to topics that emphasized her professional connection with David, rather than my role as his wife. "David's been so helpful in explaining complex property law concepts," Emma would say, when I tried to contribute insights about real estate markets. "I'm still learning how to analyze legal precedents the way experienced attorneys do, and his guidance has been invaluable for my professional development." Her comments were perfectly appropriate and professionally focused, but they consistently positioned David as her mentor and teacher, while reducing me to an observer of their intellectual partnership. The dynamic was subtle but systematic, gradually establishing Emma as someone who shared professional interest with David that I couldn't fully understand or participate in as a former financial analyst turned charity volunteer. The shift in David's behavior became more pronounced as Emma's presence in our social circle solidified. He began working later in the evenings, explaining that he was helping Emma develop research skills that would advance her career prospects within the firm. Weekend work sessions became frequent, with David spending Saturday afternoons at the office reviewing cases with Emma that allegedly required intensive mentoring to help her understand complex legal strategies. Emma's eager to learn, and her enthusiasm reminds me why I fell in love with law in the first place, David explained when I questioned the amount of time he was investing in her professional development. "Mentoring junior colleagues is part of my responsibility as a senior attorney, and Emma's potential is worth the extra effort." His description of Emma's potential was consistently glowing, emphasizing her intelligence, dedication, and natural instincts for legal analysis that surpassed what he typically saw in junior staff. When I pointed out that her background as a paralegal might not provide sufficient foundation for the advanced concepts he was supposedly teaching her, David insisted that Emma's capabilities exceeded her formal qualifications in ways that made intensive mentoring both appropriate and valuable. "Not everyone follows traditional paths to legal expertise," he said, with the defensive tone he used when his professional judgment was questioned. "Emma's analytical mind and intuitive understanding of complex issues make her an exceptional student and I'd be doing the firm a disservice if I didn't help her develop those talents fully. The language he used to describe Emma's exceptional qualities was increasingly similar to the terms he had once used to praise my own analytical abilities before marriage had transformed those qualities from attractive assets into inconvenient complications. But Emma's intelligence was apparently compatible with David's professional needs in ways that mine had never been, requiring his personal attention and guidance rather than creating awkward social situations that needed managing. The documentation of David's changing behavior began accidentally, as most life-altering discoveries do. I had started keeping a detailed calendar of our social obligations and professional commitments, primarily to manage the increasingly complex schedule that Emma's integration into our social circle had created. What began as practical organization evolved into something more systematic when patterns emerged that I couldn't ignore or rationalize away. David's work schedule had always been demanding, but his hours had become both longer and less predictable since Emma's arrival at the firm. Evening meetings that used to conclude by 7 stretched until 9 or 10. Weekend research sessions that had never been necessary before became routine occurrences, and business trips that previously required only David's attendance suddenly needed Emma's participation for purposes that were never clearly explained. The Henderson property development case requires someone with Emma's research skills, David explained when I questioned why a paralegal would accompany him to Milwaukee for client meetings that had previously been handled by partners alone. Her ability to analyze zoning regulations and municipal codes makes her invaluable for complex real estate transactions. His explanations were professionally plausible but personally suspicious, especially when combined with Emma's increasingly central role in firm social functions and David's obviously growing investment in her career advancement. The woman who had supposedly needed careful introduction to sophisticated professional couples was now co-hosting charity committee meetings and representing the firm at community events that typically required years of experience and proven social skills. I began documenting these discrepancies not out of paranoid suspicion, but from analytical habit that had been trained through years of financial research. When investment patterns seemed unusual, I investigated underlying factors that might explain apparent anomalies. When David's professional behavior began exhibiting patterns that didn't align with his previous priorities or the firm's traditional practices, I automatically began tracking data that might illuminate what was actually happening beneath the surface explanations. The calendar I maintained revealed that David and Emma were spending approximately 15 to 20 hours per week in meetings, research sessions, and travel that went beyond normal supervisor-employee interaction. Client work that had previously required individual preparation now necessitated collaborative analysis that consumed evenings and weekends. Professional development that had once been handled through formal training programs was now being conducted through intensive personal mentoring that seemed to require constant communication and frequent private consultation. More significantly, David's emotional investment in Emma's success was beginning to affect his behavior toward me in ways that were subtle but unmistakable. The man who had once valued my insights about legal and financial matters now seemed irritated when I offered observations that contradicted Emma's analysis or questioned conclusions they had reached together. My suggestions about case strategy were politely dismissed, while Emma's recommendations were enthusiastically implemented even when they conflicted with proven approaches that had served David's clients successfully for years. Emma brings a fresh perspective that challenges conventional thinking, David said when I pointed out that their innovative approach to a contract negotiation was unnecessarily complicated and potentially risky for the client. Sometimes experience can become a limitation if it prevents us from recognizing better alternatives. The implication that my professional background had become a limitation rather than an asset was particularly painful given that David had built much of his recent success on research and analysis I had provided. The zoning case that had contributed to his promotion had been solved through my investigation of municipal codes, not through fresh perspectives or innovative thinking. But Emma's contributions were apparently more valuable than mine because they came from collaborative partnership rather than supportive assistance. I began keeping more detailed records of their professional relationship, partly to understand what was happening and partly to protect myself from gaslighting that made me question my own perceptions of increasingly obvious changes in David's priorities and loyalties. The notebook I maintained included dates, times, and specific quotes that documented how systematically my role as David's intellectual partner was being transferred to Emma, even as my domestic responsibilities as his wife intensified to accommodate their professional collaboration. "Sarah's so understanding about the demands of legal practice," Emma observed during one of our dinner parties, smiling at me with what appeared to be genuine gratitude. "It must be wonderful to have a wife who supports your career so generously and doesn't resent the time you need to invest in important cases." Her comment was perfectly appropriate and seemingly supportive, but it effectively positioned me as someone whose primary function was accepting David's absence rather than contributing to his success. The intellectual partnership that had once characterized our relationship was being redefined as domestic accommodation that enabled David's real professional collaboration with Emma. The most painful entries in my documentation concerned the gradual erosion of intimacy and communication in my marriage with David. Conversations that had once included discussion of interesting cases, challenging clients, and strategic decisions were now replaced by brief updates about scheduling and social obligations. David's professional life was increasingly shared with Emma rather than with me, leaving our marriage reduced to logistics and household management rather than intellectual and emotional partnership. When I attempted to engage David in substantive discussions about legal matters or firm politics, he would often redirect the conversation to topics that didn't require professional knowledge or analytical thinking. My exclusion from his intellectual life was presented as protection from workplace stress, rather than acknowledgement that Emma had replaced me as his primary professional confidant and collaborative partner. "You don't need to worry about office, politics, and case strategy," David would say when I asked about developments at the firm that might affect our social obligations or financial planning. "Those concerns are my responsibility, and I don't want them to interfere with your focus on the volunteer work and community activities that are so important to our reputation." His language consistently positioned my interests as separate from his professional concerns, even though his career advancement directly affected our shared financial security and social position. Meanwhile, Emma's involvement in firm strategy and case development was presented as essential professional development that required David's personal attention and guidance. The business trips that had become frequent for David and Emma provided the most troubling documentation in my growing collection of evidence. Hotel reservations consistently showed adjoining rooms when separate accommodations would have been more appropriate for supervisor and employee. Meal expenses indicated dinners at romantic restaurants rather than business establishments suitable for professional meetings. Transportation records showed rental cars arranged for two people rather than individual arrangements that would maintain proper professional boundaries. "Emma and I need to coordinate our research efficiently," David explained when I questioned why their Milwaukee trip required shared transportation rather than separate arrangements. Complex real estate cases demand intensive collaboration, and managing logistics separately would waste time that should be devoted to client service. His explanations remained professionally reasonable, but the pattern of shared accommodations and coordinated travel suggested a level of personal intimacy that exceeded normal working relationships. The financial records I maintained for tax purposes revealed that David was spending significantly more on Emma's professional development than the firm typically invested in junior employee training, including expenses for conferences, meals, and travel that seemed disproportionate to her actual responsibilities. Documentation became my lifeline to sanity, as David's behavior grew increasingly dismissive toward me and increasingly protective toward Emma. When I questioned decisions that affected our household budget or social calendar, David accused me of being unsupportive of his career advancement and unreasonably suspicious of his professional relationships. But the evidence I had collected systematically demonstrated that our marriage was being systematically subordinated to his relationship with Emma, even as he insisted that nothing inappropriate was happening. "Sarah, I'm concerned about your attitude lately," David said during a particularly tense conversation about his weekend work schedule. "Emma's career development is important to the firm's success, and your resistance to the time I need to invest in mentoring her suggests jealousy that's inappropriate and destructive to our marriage." His accusation of jealousy was technically accurate but practically irrelevant. The issue wasn't emotional possessiveness, but systematic deception about the nature of his relationship with Emma and the impact their collaboration was having on our marriage. The documentation I had maintained provided objective evidence that David's priorities had shifted dramatically, even as he insisted that nothing fundamental had changed about our relationship or his commitment to our marriage. The transformation from confused wife to strategic documenter marked the beginning of my psychological separation from David, even as I continued performing the role of supportive spouse that our social circle expected. The evidence I had collected over months of careful observation provided clarity about what was happening in my marriage, but it also revealed how systematically I had been excluded from decisions that affected my own future. Understanding that David was emotionally and probably physically involved with Emma was devastating, but also liberating in unexpected ways. The confusion and self-doubt that had plagued me for months was replaced by analytical clarity that felt familiar from my professional background. I was dealing with a problem that could be researched, documented, and strategically addressed rather than an incomprehensible shift in marital dynamics that I somehow couldn't navigate successfully. The first phase of my strategic response involved strengthening the documentation I had already begun while maintaining the appearance of normalcy that would prevent David and Emma from realizing their behavior was being systematically recorded. I purchased a small digital camera that could capture images without obvious flash or sound, allowing me to photograph documents, receipts, and other evidence when opportunities arose naturally. Hotel bills left casually on David's desk revealed that his business trips with Emma consistently involved single reservations rather than the separate accommodations he claimed were being arranged. Credit card statements showed charges at intimate restaurants and expensive wine bars during their supposedly intensive work sessions. Email fragments that I glimpsed when David left his laptop open contained language that was far more personal than professional communication typically required. "Looking forward to our time together this weekend," read one message from Emma that appeared on David's computer screen while he was taking a phone call in another room. "The research we're planning will be so much more productive in a private setting where we can focus completely on each other's ideas." The language was carefully ambiguous but emotionally intimate in ways that professional collaboration didn't require. When David returned to find me near his computer, he quickly closed the message and explained that Emma was simply enthusiastic about their legal research in ways that sometimes sounded more personal than she probably intended. "She's young and doesn't always maintain professional boundaries in her communication," he said with the indulgent tone he used for Emma's supposed inexperience. "I've been trying to help her understand appropriate workplace language, but she's still learning how to express professional enthusiasm without sounding inappropriate." His explanation was plausible enough to avoid direct confrontation, but it established a pattern of protectiveness toward Emma that consistently positioned her behavior as innocent inexperience rather than calculated manipulation. David's willingness to make excuses for Emma's boundary violations while becoming increasingly critical of my legitimate questions about their relationship revealed how completely his loyalties had shifted. The second phase of my strategic response involved rebuilding the professional and financial independence that I had gradually surrendered during our marriage. The volunteer work that had replaced my career provided valuable skills and community connections that could potentially be monetized if I needed to support myself independently. The Literacy Foundation, where I served on the board, was struggling with budget management issues that required exactly the kind of financial analysis I had been trained to provide. Sarah, your reorganization of our financial systems has been transformational, said Patricia Chen, the foundation's executive director, during one of our board meetings. Have you ever considered offering financial consulting services to nonprofit organizations? There's a real need in the community for someone with your analytical skills and understanding of charitable sector challenges. Patricia's suggestion planted the seed for a business idea that could restore my financial independence while utilizing skills that had been dormant during my years as David's wife. Nonprofit financial consulting would allow me to work flexibly around social obligations while building a client base that could eventually support independent living if my marriage continued to deteriorate. I began developing a business plan for nonprofit consulting services using the same analytical approach I had once brought to investment research. The market for financial expertise in the charitable sector was underserved in Madison, particularly for small organizations that couldn't afford major accounting firms but needed sophisticated budget analysis and strategic planning. My combination of financial training and volunteer experience positioned me uniquely to serve this market niche. The business planning process required reactivating professional networks that I had maintained minimally during my marriage. Dr. Patricia Walsh, my former economics professor, was now directing the university's nonprofit management program and immediately grasped the potential for the consulting services I was proposing. Sarah, this is exactly the kind of innovative thinking that the nonprofit sector needs, she said, when I presented my preliminary business plan during a coffee meeting that I had carefully scheduled when David was traveling with Emma. Your academic background and practical experience create credibility that most consultants can't match. Have you considered teaching as well? Our program could use adjunct instructors with real-world financial experience. The teaching opportunity would provide additional income and professional credibility while allowing me to remain connected to academic networks that could support my long-term career development. But pursuing these opportunities would require time and energy that would necessarily reduce my availability for the social obligations that David considered essential to his career advancement. I began implementing my business development strategy, gradually scheduling client meetings and professional networking events during times when David was occupied with Emma or traveling for cases that required her specialized expertise. The irony that his affair was providing me with time to rebuild my professional independence wasn't lost on me, but I was grateful for any opportunity to reclaim the analytical capabilities that had been dormant for too long. The third phase of my strategic response involved preparing for the eventual confrontation that would determine whether our marriage could be salvaged or needed to be strategically concluded. The documentation I had collected provided clear evidence of David's deception, but confronting him would require careful planning to maximize my negotiating position and minimize the personal and financial damage that divorce might entail. Legal. Consultation with attorneys outside David's professional network revealed that Wisconsin's divorce laws provided reasonable protection for spouses who could demonstrate emotional and financial abandonment, particularly when one partner had systematically excluded the other from decisions affecting their shared assets and future security. The evidence I had collected of David's affair and his redirection of marital resources toward Emma's career development would strengthen my position significantly in divorce proceedings. Your documentation is exceptionally thorough, observed Jennifer Walsh, the divorce attorney I consulted confidentially. The pattern of deception and financial redirection you've established provides clear grounds for arguing that marital assets should be divided in your favor, particularly given your career sacrifices and his systematic exclusion of you from financial planning. Jennifer's assessment was encouraging, but she also warned that David's legal expertise and professional connections would make him a formidable opponent in divorce proceedings. Achieving a favorable outcome would require strategic preparation that anticipated his likely responses and protected my interests before he realized that I was planning to challenge our marriage rather than continuing to accept his behavior passively. The most important element of my strategic preparation was establishing independent financial resources that David couldn't access or control if our marriage ended. The nonprofit consulting business provided legitimate income that I could direct to separate accounts, but I also needed to document my contributions to David's career success and the financial value of the professional sacrifices I had made to support his advancement. The research I had conducted for his zoning case and other legal matters represented intellectual property that had contributed measurably to his career progression and earning potential. The social obligations I had fulfilled as his wife had provided networking opportunities and professional credibility that had direct financial value for his practice. My documentation needed to establish the economic impact of these contributions to justify compensation in any eventual divorce settlement. Creating this financial documentation required research skills that I had maintained through my volunteer work and was now developing further through my consulting business. The same analytical capabilities that had once served David's clients were now being directed toward protecting my own interests and preparing for the independence that seemed increasingly necessary for my emotional and financial survival. By the 4th year of our marriage, I had transformed from David's supportive wife into his unknowing business rival. Though he remained blissfully unaware that the woman serving his coffee each morning was simultaneously building the financial foundation that would eventually destroy his comfortable assumptions about power, control, and consequences. My nonprofit consulting business had grown beyond my most optimistic projections, generating enough income to fund a much larger strategic objective that had been forming in my mind as I watched David's professional success built increasingly on Emma's companionship and my invisible contributions. The revelation that would reshape everything came during a casual conversation with Patricia Chen, the executive director of the Literacy Foundation, where I had been volunteering and later consulting. Patricia had become not just a client, but a trusted friend who understood the complexities of balancing professional ambition with personal relationships, having navigated her own challenges as a successful woman in Madison's nonprofit sector. Sarah, I don't know if this interests you, but there's a commercial property opportunity that might be perfect for someone with your analytical skills and growing capital base, Patricia mentioned during one of our monthly strategy meetings. The Morrison building downtown is going up for sale. The owner is elderly, doesn't understand current market values, and needs a quick sale to settle estate issues. The Morrison building was a historic 6-story structure in the heart of Madison's legal district, housing several law firms, financial services companies, and professional services organizations. More importantly, it was the building where David's firm, Henderson, Morrison & Associates, had been leasing space for over 15 years, paying rent that had increased steadily as the firm's success and space requirements had grown. The asking price seems low for downtown commercial real estate, Patricia continued, showing me the listing information she had obtained through her connections in the local business community. But the building needs significant updating, and the current owner wants to avoid the complexity of managing renovations. Someone with vision and capital could probably acquire it well below market value. The opportunity was intriguing from a pure investment perspective, but it became irresistible when I realized the strategic implications of owning the building where David worked. As his landlord, I would have access to information about the firm's financial health, growth projections, and long-term planning that could inform my own decisions about our marriage and my future security. More immediately, controlling his professional environment would provide leverage that could prove useful if our relationship continued to deteriorate. I spent the following week conducting the kind of thorough financial analysis that had made me successful as an investment consultant, researching property values, rental income potential, renovation costs, and market trends that would affect the building's long-term value. The numbers were compelling enough to justify the investment from a purely economic standpoint, but the personal satisfaction of potentially becoming David's landlord provided additional motivation that made the risks seem acceptable. The financing, for the acquisition required creativity and strategic planning that reminded me why I had loved complex financial puzzles during my previous career. My consulting business provided steady income but not sufficient capital for a major real estate purchase. However, my years of careful documentation of David's career advancement and my contributions to his success had given me detailed understanding of our shared assets and his earning potential that could support creative financing arrangements. The house we shared in Maple Bluff had appreciated significantly since our marriage, largely due to improvements I had managed and financed through careful budget planning. My name was on the deed as joint owner, which meant I could potentially access equity through refinancing without requiring David's explicit approval if the paperwork was handled carefully. The investments we had made with my former income had grown substantially, particularly the portfolio I had managed before David had assumed control of our financial planning. More importantly, I had been systematically documenting the intellectual property value of my contributions to David's legal cases, including the zoning analysis that had contributed to his promotion and numerous other research projects that had enhanced his reputation within the firm. While these contributions hadn't been formally compensated, they represented value that could be quantified and potentially monetized if our marriage ended in divorce proceedings. Working with Jennifer Walsh, the divorce attorney I had been consulting, confidentially, I developed a legal strategy that would allow me to access marital assets for investment purposes that served our shared financial interests, even if David wasn't fully informed about the specific opportunity I was pursuing. The Morrison Building acquisition could be structured as a family investment that enhanced our portfolio diversification and provided stable rental income that would benefit both of us regardless of our marital status. "This is actually quite clever," Jennifer observed when I explained my acquisition strategy during one of our discreet consultations. "If you purchase the building through a family trust or limited liability company, you're making an investment that benefits both spouses while establishing your independent business expertise. Even if David objects later, you'll have documented legal grounds for the financial decisions you're making." The legal structure we developed created Wilson Properties LLC, named for my maiden name and established as a family investment vehicle that could acquire and manage commercial real estate. I was designated as the managing member with authority to make operational decisions, while David's interests were protected through ownership structure that gave him financial benefits without requiring his daily involvement in property management. Approaching the Morrison Building's elderly owner required diplomatic skills that I had developed through years of nonprofit consulting and community volunteer work. Helen Morrison was 84 years old, recently widowed, and overwhelmed by the complexity of managing commercial real estate that her late husband had handled throughout their marriage. She wanted to sell quickly but fairly to someone who would respect the building's historic character while maintaining its role in Madison's professional community. "Mrs. Morrison, I understand that you want to find the right buyer for your husband's building," I told her during our initial meeting in her modest apartment, surrounded by photographs of the property during its construction in the 1920s. My consulting work with local organizations has given me deep appreciation for Madison's business community, and I'd be honored to continue your family's legacy of supporting professional services that benefit our city. Helen Morrison was charmed by my combination of professional competence and personal respect for her family's history, but she was also practical enough to require serious financial qualifications before considering any offer. The documentation I provided of my consulting business, my academic credentials, and the financial structure of Wilson Properties LLC convinced her that I was a legitimate buyer who could complete the transaction efficiently while preserving the building's character and tenant relationships. "You remind me of myself when I was younger," Helen told me during our second meeting, where I presented a formal purchase offer that was fair to her while still providing excellent value for my investment. Women didn't have the same opportunities in business when I was starting out, but I always believed that with enough determination and intelligence, we could accomplish anything we set our minds to. The purchase negotiations proceeded smoothly. Over the following month, with Helen Morrison accepting my offer after minimal counter-proposals. The financing arrangement I had structured through Wilson Properties LLC allowed me to complete the acquisition using a combination of equity from our marital assets, income from my consulting business, and a commercial mortgage that would be serviced through rental income from existing tenants. The legal paperwork was handled by attorneys outside David's professional network, ensuring that news of the transaction wouldn't reach him through informal channels before I was ready to reveal my new role as his landlord. The closing was scheduled for a Friday afternoon in November, exactly 1 week before the firm's annual holiday party, where David planned to introduce Emma as his official research associate to clients and colleagues who still assumed their relationship was purely professional. The irony that I would become David's landlord just days before he made his relationship with Emma more public wasn't lost on me. But it also felt like poetic justice for the years of systematic dismissal and intellectual theft I had endured. The woman he had trained to be invisible in his professional life was about to become the person who controlled his working environment and had access to confidential information about his firm's financial stability and growth prospects. Signing the closing documents for the Morrison building felt like reclaiming something essential that had been gradually stripped away during my marriage. For the first time in years, I was making a major financial decision based on my own analysis and judgment rather than seeking David's approval or accommodating his preferences. The investment represented not just economic opportunity, but psychological liberation from the passive role that marriage had gradually imposed on my relationship with money, property, and professional achievement. The building inspection I conducted after the closing revealed that the property was in better condition than the previous owner had realized, with solid structural systems and historic architectural details that enhanced its value significantly. The existing tenants included established businesses that provided stable rental income, but there was also potential for expansion and improvement that could increase revenue substantially with proper management and strategic renovations. Henderson, Morrison and Associates occupied nearly half of the building's rentable space across 3 floors, paying monthly rent that represented approximately 40% of the property's total income. Their lease had 2 years remaining before renewal, which meant that David's firm would eventually need to negotiate new terms with me as their landlord, though he wouldn't discover that fact until I chose to reveal it. The other tenants included a small accounting firm, a financial planning company, and several individual attorneys who rented office space with shared conference facilities. All were successful professionals who had established their practices in the building over multiple years, providing stability and community reputation that enhanced the property's value beyond simple rental income calculations. Managing the building would require time and attention that I could integrate with my consulting business, since many of the same organizational and financial skills applied to both property management and nonprofit advisory services. The additional income would accelerate my accumulation of independent wealth while providing practical experience in commercial real estate that could lead to additional investment opportunities. But the most satisfying aspect of the acquisition was the psychological shift it represented in my relationship with David and Emma. Instead of being the betrayed wife who discovered her husband's affair and responded with emotional confrontation or passive acceptance, I had become a strategic player who was building financial power while they remained focused on their romantic drama and professional advancement that depended increasingly on my invisible support. David's success at Henderson, Morrison and Associates had been built partly on research I had provided and social connections I had maintained, but it also depended on the stability and reputation of the firm itself. As the building's new owner, I now had access to information about lease terms, financial obligations, and expansion plans that could affect both David's career prospects and the firm's long-term viability. The knowledge that I could potentially control David's professional environment provided security that went beyond simple financial independence. If our marriage ended badly, if he attempted to minimize my contributions to his success, or if Emma's influence continued to grow at my expense, I now had leverage that could affect his career directly rather than simply protecting my own interests defensively.